You've got the Pfizer jab, which reporting suggests it could be here on Monday. There may well be an announcement today on that. We'll have to wait and see. Meanwhile, AstraZeneca rolling off the production line next week. Plenty to be excited about on that front.
Yeah, it's all happening, isn't it? It's a bit overwhelming at the moment with the amount of information, but it's a good news. It's still some work to be done, even when the Pfizer vaccine, for example, appears, because there needs to be what we call batch testing to make sure Australia is very careful about it, to make sure that it's actually up to standard before we actually get into it. But yeah, by getting towards the end of February, that's when things are probably going to start in terms of the vaccinating.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, just on that point, then, what happens then? So once the Pfizer jab arrives here, again, expectation is that it'll be next week, possibly even Monday. What's the process?
Well, there's only got to be a small amount at the start. And I think that's a really important aspect of this. This is still quite a long process for the whole vaccine program over most of this year. And so the small amounts we're going to have are going to be initially batch tested. And then after that, once they're tested and given the tick of approval, then they're going to be distributed, and they're going to be distributed fairly into the sort of what we call the initial hubs, which are going to be able to handle this really difficult vaccine, because it has to be kept at -70, transported in obviously with at that temperature, and sent to these areas to be given to the people most likely to get it first or get really sick, and they're going to be the frontliners. And I think at the moment we're looking very much at those hotel quarantine workers.
Sure, yeah, and so that takes days, weeks.
Oh, really? We are talking about that. So
yeah.
It's really the very beginning of something that's going to roll on for most of this year.
Yeah, and then as for the AstraZeneca jab, there's still some approvals that are needed on that front, but the government hasn't really shifted in its expectations. All seems to be around March, still on track. What's the process there?
That one still has to be approved by the TGA. There is some thought that it's going to be soon. The WHO have said just get on with it, and it looks like a good vaccine. So once it gets approved and they're already manufacturing it, then we can start getting that out as well. But that'll be a relatively simpler vaccine because of the fact it can be kept at normal refrigerated temperature. But again, the first lots are going to go to whatever we've got. The first lots are going to go to those frontline workers, health workers, and also the aged care facilities as well, the staff and the residents, because they are going to be the ones most likely to get sick or the ones most likely to catch it in the first place.
And then what happens with the booster jab? That's still a few more months down the track, isn't it?
Yeah, and that will be a while away. And there's still a bit of a debate about whether we should be doing it in a shorter period of time, which was initially what it was thought, or at the sort of 12-week stage, particularly with the AstraZeneca, because it does appear that works better if you wait a little bit longer before the second shot. The Pfizer is normally given it at that 21 days straight afterwards, so that's a much quicker process. But it's interesting in the UK that the process has really been focusing on getting that first shot in, because we know that once you've got one shot, you're going to at least have some level of protection. And the question is whether to more widely spread that first shot and then not worry so much about the second one, but make sure you get it sooner or later, or to make sure you always get the second shot, but you have less people vaccinated.
Doctor, our lead story this morning is about these fears potentially of a third wave of an outbreak in Melbourne. Do you share those concerns? Do you share those fears?
Look, I think we should be extremely worried about these new strains, which look as though they are much more infectious. Now, it does appear that there was a mistake in the hotel quarantine, that a nebuliser was able to get through, and somebody who was infected used a nebuliser, and essentially created this aerosol spread by essentially creating a fog of COVID throughout that floor or throughout the hotel, because basically they made these tiny little droplets which just hung up in the air and has infected so many people. Luckily, it does appear to be contained to the hotel at the moment, but the problem is because of the increased infectivity, the question is whether it's got out of the bag. And with these strains, we are really worried that we can't put the lid on it once it gets out. That's why the various states, all the recent ones, have all been these new strains. They've been really harsh on the response because of the concern about that, because it is our first line of defence. And so far, we've been living in such a sort of a calm way, and we haven't got our vaccines out yet. We need to hold that line as long as possible. And no, we are worried because of these new strains.
So is it out of the bag? Do you believe it could well be out of the bag?
So far, so good, but it could still be. And that's why the other states have taken a pretty hard line on this because they are worried, particularly was at the airport as well, which is the other
Yeah.
concern, that it may be out of the bag. And look, I think there is a chance of that, but let's just hold our breath, see whether we can dodge another bullet.
Yeah. Who's stuffed up here, in your opinion, when it comes to that nebuliser?
Look, I think there's actually two aspects to this. I think we're going to have to review the whole hotel quarantine situation. We have to keep on revising our thinking about this because of these new strains. I think obviously the nebuliser got through the net and it wasn't supposed to be used. I think the other aspect the AMA is still not happy about is the fact that the Australian guidelines on the whole thought about COVID is still behind the rest of the world in not acknowledging enough this aerosol spread. Because this aerosol spread is, it's not the droplets which you can just essentially cough and spit onto somebody else. This is the stuff that sits up in the air for too long. And our guidelines are behind the rest of the world. And because of that, the policy making is based on this sort of behind thinking. And that means, for example, personal protection equipment levels, we believe, and also a whole number of things, the ventilation side of things, are not up to standard at the moment in terms of the thinking. And again, we've got to, especially the hotel quarantine, but also frontline health staff, we've got to be thinking at that high. We're thinking about abundance of caution in every other area except this area where we are behind. And that's where the AMA does have some concerns.
Okay. Chris Moy, Doctor, good to get your thoughts. As always, thanks for joining us here. We'll talk to you again soon.
It's a pleasure.